Hi, I'm Mark Lynch, Director of the Project on Middle East Political Science and the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. Welcome back to the POMEPS Conversations, our series of conversations with leading scholars in the field. With me today is David Faris of Roosevelt University and author of the new book, Dissent and Revolution in a Digital Age, Social Media, Blogging, and Activism in Egypt. David, welcome to GW.
Thanks, Mark. Nice to be here.
Now, so why don't you tell us a little bit about the book? How did it come about, and how did it develop in the course of the writing? I mean, a revolution kind of happened in the middle of it, right?
Yeah, that was a little awkward. The book started as a project in 2006. So I was in Egypt doing some research, and I met a series of bloggers who were doing coordinating work with Kifaya, which is the sort of umbrella opposition group in Egypt from that time period. And I thought that they were doing really interesting things. I thought that they were saying things online that were not being said in traditional media. And I thought they were forging alliances with traditional journalists. And I really just wanted to know what effect it was having, because they were thinking of themselves as challenging authoritarianism in Egypt. I wanted to go back and see whether that was in fact the case. So that was sort of the genesis of the research and the question that I was trying to get at. And I finished that project in 2010, defended the dissertation. I wasn't sure what would really happen with it ultimately. And then 5 months later, many of the people that I had interviewed and worked with when I was there doing the research between 2007 and 2009 were sort of leading drivers of the protests that ultimately resulted in the removal of Hosni Mubarak from power. So it was very interesting having to go back and take what had been just kind of a predictive theory about what might happen if this kind of organizing continued, and then look at the sort of the results of the organizing and see whether that outcome of mass mobilization fit with the theory that I had come up with.
And from the way you approached things, even if there had been no revolution, you still would have thought that the impact of social media was significant.
I did, and I thought it at the time, even before the revolution happened. I thought that the combination of bloggers and then later social media activists, people using Facebook and Twitter and forming groups, I thought that they were having an effect on the environment of public discourse in Egypt that I think was qualitatively different, say, in 2010 than it was in the year 2000. That it had opened up space for marginalized groups, marginalized publics to bring their grievances and their demands into the public sphere. So I thought that they were setting the agenda, even if ultimately the goals of the agenda that they really wanted to see happen didn't happen.
Now, if there's such a small group and they're having more impact and more access to the public sphere, is that necessarily representative of Egypt as a whole?
That's a great question. They're not representative of Egypt as a whole, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. But the thing is that just because they're not representative does not mean that they're not having an impact. So I think that these are two different variables, right? The extent to which they represent the broad concerns of sort of ordinary, poor, marginalized Egyptians, but then the extent to which they have an agenda-setting function in the public sphere. And so that disjuncture is important, but I think it's also allows us to also see the way that those dynamics empower this small set of elites to write about things, to have those ideas picked up by other journalists and other thinkers, and then to make them part of political discourse, even if they don't represent, people in Upper Egypt or something. It's like they're still important; they're just not representative.
So you've been following this for something like a decade. Then, how has the online discourse changed over time as more and more people join the internet or follow the internet, more different kinds of voices from a wider subset of Egyptian society? How does that change things if it's no longer just this small group of vanguard activists?
Well, the evolution in this stuff over time is really fascinating. In the early years, it really was this sort of small elite of English speakers, or English Arabic speakers who were speaking both to Egyptians but also to international audiences and trying to reach out to Western audiences to bring attention to, I think, some of the things that were happening in Egypt. And I think those folks were particularly unrepresentative of the broader Egyptian public. There's a blogger who went by Sand Monkey, who ran for parliament last year unsuccessfully, and one of the other activists said, he represents himself and 10 other people in the republic, And so the movement away from that sort of solo voice, sort of vitriolic blogging where it's like, this page is my platform and I'm going to write about these 3 things and I'm going to say whatever I want.
But your point is that those people are significant anyway because they're pushing the public sphere, they're introducing new ideas, so they don't have to be representative. So even if a single particular blogger is not representing more than 10 people, you would still find that significant.
I would, particularly if that single person has influence with journalists. In other words, people that can take the story and then run with it on a platform that more people will see.
Because things like Masr al-Yom and the new independent press, that's a big part of your story as well, the linkages between social media and traditional media.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think that was a key variable. When you look at the percentages of Egyptians that had access to the internet during the sort of mid-2000s, it was very small, 5, 10%. And so it was only by the sort of social networks between traditional journalists who were writing for these new outlets and the bloggers that allowed the things that the bloggers were pushing to get out into the public sphere. I think those linkages are no longer as necessary as they were in, say, 2004 and 2005. I think that there's now a critical mass of Egyptians who are online, not quite a majority of the population, but we're getting there. And that creates all kinds of new opportunities for the diffusion of media forums and new websites and sort of new practices of journalism that has, I think, brought many more Egyptians from more diverse social and political backgrounds into the conversation.
So let's fast forward past the revolution. I think we've all gone over the revolution story many times. After Mubarak falls, what happens with the online activists and social media? What changes?
Well, I think immediately they started organizing for a series of these electoral confrontations with the military regime first. And the first of those confrontations was about the approval of the Constitution in March 2011. And the activists, they kept losing these confrontations, right? So they were using the same tools that they used to generate the mobilization in January 2011, but increasingly they were unable to translate their success in organizing demonstrations into success in competing in sort of normal electoral politics. I don't know if I would describe electoral politics in Egypt as normal right now, but as normal as it could be. And so the community continued to use the tools at their disposal to press sort of their version of events. The no vote on the Constitution, right, or the sort of revolutionary alliance in the parliamentary elections. They just weren't very successful at doing it.
Now, with the theory developed in your book, give us any explanation as to why that is. Why didn't the tools translate from one period to the next?
Well, I think that the tools really allow for mobilization and group formation. They don't necessarily make any prediction about whether your efforts in that regard will be successful. And once the sort of broader mass of Egyptians who have different ideas about politics were brought into this process, I think the activists were no longer able to have the success that they had before, primarily because the politics were different, right? And that's, I think, a key variable here. Prior to the uprising, it was this small set of issues, torture, corruption, human rights, and Mubarak, about which, not that many Egyptians in the opposition disagreed, right? Once the uprising is over, you have a real fragmented political landscape in which it's no longer enough to say, to start a Facebook group because the issues that you're pushing don't have the same broader universal resonance that some of the issues prior to the uprising had.
Do you see this as a failure of the activists or something which is built in to the structure of online versus offline political organizing?
I think it's partially structural. That is, the activists who were most skilled at deploying the tools and using them over time were politically weak and politically disconnected from the broader swath of Egyptians. But I also think it's a little unfair to the activists themselves to expect, a lot of these guys these men and women are in their 20s and 30s, and to expect this group of people to suddenly assume political power. I don't think that that's how we've seen things happen in other sort of democratic transitions. Unfortunately, we don't really speak about Egypt as a democratic transition anymore, but I think the expectation always should have been that the older generation of politicians who are skilled in retail politics and coalition building would be the ones who benefited the most from the political transition in Egypt.
Well, let's talk about that, about where we are right now. How would you explain this kind of surge of online enthusiasm for June 30th, for General Assisi, and against the Muslim Brotherhood? I mean, where does that come from, and how does that fit into your understanding of this networked public?
I think that there was always a latent anti-Brotherhood sentiment in the broader activist community. There's those who were most responsible for organizing the protests over time, and even in April 6th. I don't think April 6th was a particularly Islamist-friendly organization. And so I don't think that they were ever happy about having to go in and vote for Morsi over Shafik in 2012, and that given the opportunity, they were very quick to turn on this coalition. And so what's happening right now is that revolutionary alliance has been fractured. The Morsi regime made a series of really catastrophic errors, including the attacks at Ittihadiyya in December, and that turned the activists against them. I don't think that they were ever particularly in favor of them to begin with. It was always an alliance of convenience. But every misstep by the Morsi regime was magnified, I think, by the social media tools, right?
Although there's a difference between breaking the revolutionary coalition and the active enthusiasm for the military, which now seems to permeate much of Egyptian social media and, frankly, Egyptian politics. Did you also see a latent pro-military nationalism, or is this something which is qualitatively new?
This is, I think, really the most shocking thing that's happened in the last year, is I didn't see any latent pro-military sentiment in the activist community. If anything, they had been very critical of SCAF during the transition period. And so this very sudden shift just strikes me as less ideological than it is tactical. That is, we sense an opportunity to press the advantage against the Brotherhood, and we're seizing it, and we're using sort of frames and narratives that glorify the military. And that's very surprising to me, but I don't have any other good theory about what's happening there.
So I guess last question, after spending all this time studying social media and putting it within the broader Egyptian political context, if you were going to look in one place or a small number of places for signs of where Egypt might be going next, what would you look at? Would you be looking at Twitter trends, Facebook, regular media, talking to people in private? I mean, what do you see as the best way to get a grip on or get a handle on where things might be going?
I don't think that there's any one place that you can look. I think you have to follow people who are prominent and look at, because some of the organizations that were prominent prior to the uprising are still prominent now. That is April 6th, that is We Are Al Khalid Said. I mean, interesting things are happening, like the Arabic and the English versions of We Are Al Khalid Said are split and have different positions on what's been happening. So it's not like you can say, I'm going to take these prominent organizations and look at what they're saying, and then I'll know what's happening in Egypt. I think it requires a broad, sustained effort to monitor different forms of media, including Masri al-Yawm, and including Twitter, including the Facebook groups, and including all of these new online news sources that have flowered in the post-uprising period. And that is, beyond that, I'm not sure that we can get a sense of the sort of broader political direction just by monitoring media, right? I think that we need to be talking to people on the ground. I think that we need to be taking seriously the long-term interests of military elites and what they would like to see happen in Egypt. And so it's a challenge.
Right now, would you still characterize Egypt as having significant political dissent, or is that something which has faded from the scene?
I still believe that there's dissent in Egypt, and I do think that this moment that we see right now, where the broad activist community is aligned itself with the military, I don't think that that's going to last. And I think that the events of, say, the year after the uprising are evidence that that's not a coalition that can last, because the military elites, I think, still want things that the activists are not going to give them without a fight. that is, impunity and sort of extra constitutional privileges. I think that the alliance will last only as long as the Brotherhood is perceived as a threat that they agree is the main problem in Egypt. And if the Brotherhood is successfully removed from the scene, someone will take their place, perhaps the Noor, and I think you'll see that. I think you'll see that coalition split, and that all of these tools and practices that have evolved over the past 10 years will continue to be, I'd say, like the default form of dissent and boundary pushing in Egypt, even with all of the sort of unfortunate changes that have taken place in the last year or so. I still do have some confidence that these tools will be available for activists once this moment passes.
All right, David Faris, Roosevelt University, author of the new book, Dissent and Revolution in a Digital Age. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.